I am grateful to see you, Cynthia Black. Today, I'm especially glad that you're here to help me write the May edition of The Pine Tree, which is the newsletter that I share with the clergy in Maine. And among other things, you are the chair of the Episcopal Church's Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. And I hope that you'll give us a better perspective, a bigger perspective of the general church's attention to liturgy and music in these days. You and I, by my count, have a 33-year history together. And so you might tell us something, a story maybe at the end of this conversation about that. And you've served churches in a variety of contexts, but now in this role as chair of a pretty significant governing body, it would be especially helpful for us to, I hope, talk about um, what the Standing Commission is, how one gets to be on it, and what you're up to. And then what I'd like is to tell you a little bit about what's happening in Maine with liturgy and music, and also get your take on what you're seeing regarding music, liturgical experimentation, innovation across the church. And then finally, to end with a discussion about two specific things. The first being so-called open communion, and the second being how the church in Maine might contribute to the bigger church's liturgical life. That is, what might we do to help advance the cause? So first, tell us about who you are and your favorite memory of Maine.
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful way to start. Sure. I am currently retired. I retired a little over a year ago from having served a very progressive church in the Diocese of Newark, the Church of the Redeemer in Morristown. And as you know, but the folks who are watching this don't, we have known each other since the days of Kalamazoo in the very early 90s. So that's why those we go back 30 plus years very happily. And I am, yes, as you say, the chair of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. So let me tell you a little bit. Oh, Maine. Oh, yeah,
Your favorite memory or
I
something?
can't move on without that. Wow. I could pick many, but the many times sitting in the morning on the deck of my parents' house in York Harbor, which was right on the ocean. My dad was an architect. It was a house he designed and then redesigned in later years. And watching the tide being in many ways sort of an anchor for me.
Hmm.
And when I despair of the world and not knowing what will come next, I know that the tide will come in and the tide will go out, just as it has for millennia. Just like the sun will rise and the sun will set, we may not see it. The tide will come in and the tide will go out. I mean, such a rock. And as you know, that house that my parents had was called the Rock because it was built on a lot of rock. So Maine is a wonderful
Do you,
place.
do you know what's your first memory of Maine? I mean, the sort of memory of the tide is sort of with you in a big way, but is there a particular first memory? Because you were an infant when you first came here, right?
Yeah. It's the beach. It's absolutely the beach and the sand, and building sand castles and all of that. And it would have been at the little harbor beach, um, down by what would have been now I'm forgetting the name of the resort, but but it's now by the Stage Neck Inn. I'm trying to remember the name of the Marshall. Yeah. Anyway, someone older than I can probably remember the name of the resort that was there. But yeah, nice little harbor beach that we would go to every day. Yeah.
It's
Yep.
great.
All right. So the SCLM is dictated by canon, what it does and what it doesn't do. And it is very clearly not the liturgy police. You get to be that.
Mm.
That is the role of bishops, to a certain degree. But what we are primarily responsible for is when it is the will of the church through General Convention for prayer book revision.
Mm.
And hymnal revision as well. And when it is not the will of the church, when we are between those things, to collect and catalog and pay attention to things that might go into future prayer books and hymnals. And in addition to that, we receive names of folks that might be added to our sanctoral calendar. And there's various other minutia kinds of things, but that's the big picture of what we do.
How does one get to be on it?
It's appointed by the presiding officers of General Convention, the President of the House of Deputies, and the presiding bishop. There are currently 25 members, and it's a 6-year term. Each general convention, at the end of convention, a notice will go out, and it goes out to the whole church. You don't have to be a general convention deputy,
Ah.
although general convention deputies do tend to be aware of this, because they're often the first ones to receive the notice and tend to receive more of these kinds of notices than the average Episcopalian clergy or lay. But if you are interested in serving, the time to be aware is right after a general convention, when a notice will go out, and you don't actually get to say you want to serve on the SCLM. You put in your name and you say what your strengths are, and then the presiding officers will appoint people that they believe have the qualities that a particular governing body needs. And it may be the SLM or not. I have to say that I was delightfully surprised. And in many ways, it was a dream that I had had since I was your age. Um, anyway, and then to get to the point where I was asked to chair it was an even greater privilege.
Awesome. And so that's a little bit about the work and sort of how one gets to be on it. When you think about sort of the hot issues or the pressing issues or the things that are occupying the commission's attention right now, tell us about some of those.
Well, I've just come from a meeting that will be a group of people that will be helping to rethink the Constitution and canons around a lot of the issues that the church is dealing with in terms of the future of the prayer book. One of the things that we authorized on a second reading, which some things require 2 readings at General Convention. Fortunately, very few, but this one did. It was a revision of Article 10, which is part of our Constitution, which has to do with how the prayer book is defined.
Mm.
And while we call what we worship with the Book of Common Prayer, in its most technical sense now, it is technically not a book. And I say technically because I don't want that to strike fear in anyone's heart, that somehow technology is going to replace that book you were given at confirmation or when you were ordained or whenever, that and love and has well-worn pages. There will always be a book, at least, as, as,
In our
as long as
lifetime.
books are, yeah, certainly in our lifetime. Certainly as long as books are in general use in our culture. But um, the need it came time for us to recognize that there are many other forms being used, and I would venture to say that most of the clergy in your diocese are using other forms for
Mhm.
worship on Sunday morning, in addition to the Book of Common Prayer,
Mhm.
whether that's how they reproduce them on a Sunday morning, whether it's a full service that's printed out in a leaflet, whether it's a screen, or through these kinds of means, through broadcast or whatever. And so, in order to look forward into the future of the church and ways to include, especially other cultural expressions, so that the Episcopal Church is not bound by, um, you know, uh,
Well,
uh, literally bound by a book, but also a one socioeconomic, racial, etc. profile. Um, the only way to do that was to unbind the book. Um, and as you know, for many years, we've had supplemental materials that have taken into account things like expansive language. We have developed resources for particular days, and in order to eventually consider whether those might be part of our common prayer, we needed to expand um, how we define that. So this meeting that I've just come from, um, the canons of the church are not exactly my favorite thing in the world, but it's incredibly important work because we're now going to define what has the authority, what
mhm.
the people of your diocese can use without asking you for your permission,
Yeah, yeah.
what has the weight of that
Of
book,
common prayer.
even though it may not be physically in the book. And
Yeah,
that is what is our common prayer. Even if it's not in the book, they are authorized to use it without getting anybody's permission.
yeah,
And there are plenty of other resources that may not have um, Book of Common Prayer weight, but are authorized to be used without getting your permission. So one of the things that the SELM has struggled with is defining those terms.
mm,
And then there are other things. There was a lovely resolution that came to General Convention last year about an Armenian rite. There's a priest, I believe, in Montana, who has brought this to convention before, and the House of Bishops. I can't remember where the no came, but I think it got sent back maybe to SCLM. Anyway, I suspect that it will it will become one of those things that is not authorized, but we needed a term for it. So that if somebody, for example, in the Diocese of Maine wanted to use it, there would be a way for that, it would be available to them and a way for them to, a way forward. So we need ways to define each of those things in the canons, and that's what we are striving to do. So just another part of the work that can be
well,
tedious at
it
times,
sounds to me
but
like it's really about getting clarity
exactly.
about
Yeah.
the moment that we're in versus the moment that we were in the last 100 years.
Yes. Yep.
And
Yep.
so one of the questions that I have is about we speak fairly regularly in Maine about this diocese being a place where liturgical experimentation and innovation is a hallmark of who we are and what we do and why we're here.
Yeah.
And that is grateful for predecessors, especially Bishop Lane and Knutson, who really, I think, in some ways, I would say, each in their own way was a pioneer about this. And I'm glad to keep up the work, basically. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what the SELM, how would you all, what are some of the ways that you've heard the commission describe or work towards defining what we mean by liturgical experimentation and innovation? What do those words mean, maybe to you personally, but more importantly, where do they land for the rest of the church?
Sure. Uh, I think probably the most important thing, especially for the folks in your diocese to know, is that regardless of what you or I think about it, there are principles readily available to them on the Episcopal Church's liturgy website. And so if you do edit this video, which I don't think you are planning to do, but a resource that you could give them is episcopalcommonprayer.org. That is the Episcopal Church's official liturgy website, episcopalcommonprayer.org. And in the section under links, there is a section of guidelines, and one of the things that is there is principles to guide the development of liturgical texts.
There you go.
And these were adopted at the 2022 General
A
Convention.
kind of
And
COVID one in Baltimore, right?
yes, yeah.
Mhm.
And they are really fantastic. So in 2018, uh, General Convention appointed a task force on liturgical and prayer book revision, the acronym for which was TIFLPIPR, which mostly the folks who were on that just loved saying that. And to this day, they love to tell you that they were on the TIFLPIPR committee. But anyway, they were the ones that were responsible for this work and got the ball rolling with these changes to Article 10 so that we could look forward to some liturgical change. And one of the things I will just read a little bit from those
Mhm.
guidelines. In describing characteristics of new liturgical texts, the 2018 General Convention enumerated the following. This is what they're specifically looking for: things that utilize the riches of Holy Scripture and our church's liturgical, cultural, racial, generational, linguistic, gender, physical ability, class, and ethnic diversity in order to share common worship. Utilizing inclusive and expansive language and imagery for humanity and divinity, incorporating and expressing understanding, appreciation, and care of God's creation, and engaging the deep baptismal and Eucharistic theology and practice of the 1979 prayer book. So expanding on all of those things. Um, anyway, I would encourage people to take a look at those principles
Mhm.
because they will help them when they want to think about whatever it is that they're considering, whether it's a um, statement of faith, uh, um, intercessions, and then there are other resources available for prayers of the people besides what's there. And I would draw their attention to a old but very useful resource for that, and that would be Orman Plater's book, which I think is still available on Amazon. It's called Intercession.
Session, yeah.
Um,
So you are anticipating something I wanted to talk about, which is a kind of pet peeve of mine, which is that I'm mostly bored to tears with the six forms of prayers of the people in
or-
our prayer book.
yeah,
And one of the things that I encourage folk to look at is the actual rubric that precedes the intercessions, which the way that I was taught and the way I read is that really the preference is for intercessions to be composed,
yeah,
and that those six forms in the prayer book, what I like to say is we should think of those as a default, or something that we would use, I would say, from time to time, and to cultivate in our local communities people who have the gift of composition
absolutely.
to write intercessions. And then the second thing about prayers of the people, just because you mentioned it, and it's like putting a quarter in me about this particular thing, is sometimes when I'm in congregations where there is composed intercessions, locally composed, uh, they're so darned long. And so is there anything that the SCLM could provide us in Maine for a congregation who wants to explore composing intercessions, are there just some basic guidelines about, I mean, of course, there are the six categories, but is there a tactful way for a clergy person to say to the lay poet who's writing prayers, you don't have to write every single petition every Sunday?
Well, yes, I guess the quick answer is the page 383, prayer is offered with intercession for. and, and it just lists the six categories. I mean, it doesn't have to
Yeah, that there aren't 19 categories.
yeah. Yeah. I remember as a kid there was an air traffic controller strike. Um and my family was attending worship that day at the cathedral in Boston. And the very well-intentioned deacon um prayed for everyone who, from the person who the people who paved the runways to the electricians who wired the equipment. The specificity. I and some
Um,
one of us turned to some other and said, "You'd think that God doesn't have any imagination." And I've never forgotten that.
yeah.
And sometimes when our prayers get a little too specific or a little too long, I think to myself, you'd think that God doesn't
Air
have any
traffic controller
imagination.
strike. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I want to shift gears a little bit and sort of talk about music, and to say that I know that Maine is not alone. We are not unique in the fact that it's music is a challenge in many of our places, and
Sure.
not just in our rural places and not just in our small places. That resources of people who are trained to lead music, to lead singing, and you and I know, and everybody listening to this and watching this Zoom, we know that there's a difference between someone who is trained to play a piano or an organ and someone who can lead people to sing. And I know there are resources like Music That Makes Community, but say something about what you know about the rest of the church and about the SELM when it comes to talking about and giving resources of music to the church.
Well, I just heard a story from a bishop who, obviously, bishops have an opportunity to experience worship in far more congregations than most of the rest of us do. But they talked about their experience with worshiping in small congregations that only have those, and I have never experienced this, so I don't know what it's like. Those electronic things where you push a button and out comes a hymn. Um, s- and this is a person who majored in music or theater or both. I'm not sure which um, in as an undergraduate, and they said at first they were horrified that this was how music was glorifying God, and after a very short period of time, they came to fully appreciate that that this was available, and that the congregations were availing themselves of it because it was approachable and it was a resource that um, meant that they could have music. So it was
So,
an interesting shift to me. And
right.
as I
So
said, I
some of,
haven't experienced it, so I don't know the value of the resource except to hear that bishop's take on it as from someone who, presumably has um, a little has some appreciation for fine music.
yeah. So some of that story leads me to say that some of us need to chill out when it
Mm,
comes to expectations or definitions of what we consider to be either proper or good.
yeah.
And that story of that bishop somewhat being converted to
Yeah.
something that at one time, and I'm probably in that camp, I'm not yet converted. I think they're tacky. And so maybe the challenge is for those of us who would describe something that's innovative and does allow people to sing, to be a little less quick to declare something tacky and a little more willing, a lot more willing to say, all right, so in this particular place, it makes sense. And in this particular place, it may not make sense, but uh, having an organist is no longer an option. And so we need to think about other ways to make music. So I don't think it's probably not the biggest, it's probably not the most frequent question that I get, but it is in some ways the most emotional question I get is how can you help us with music?
Mm,
Like we are always saying in the bishop's office, we're always saying, the reason we exist is to help you and your church get the resources you need to do the
mm,
ministry you feel
mm.
called to do. So, that's like a broken record. And it's really hard for my office to deliver on that
Yeah.
pledge when it comes to church music. And maybe it's just enough to say today that this is a thing and it's not unique to Maine. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It may be a little flippant, but one thing you might suggest to people is that they attend school board meetings
Mm.
because that's where this problem starts. It's in music education.
Oh,
It's the fact that we are not producing. Um,
mm,
there's no expectation that kids will take piano lessons,
mm,
and the lack of pianists is producing a lack of organists, and the fact that we've cut most music education from elementary schools on up
mm,
means that choral programs aren't what they used to be, and so we aren't singing. And the expectation is that if you sing, you have to be the best. You have
yeah.
to be, a pop star kind of level of singer.
Mm,
I was just with somebody recently who told a story about traveling in New Zealand, and they were in a restaurant, and all of a sudden there were a bunch of Maori folks, local indigenous folks, in that restaurant, just having lunch or dinner or whatever it was, and all of a sudden they burst into song. I don't remember the person describing what it was about, but it was just there was nothing odd about it. Whereas in our culture, th-
mm,
that wouldn't happen. Probably because our expectation is the only people who would sing in public would be people who are well trained and really
choir.
good at it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is extremely helpful for me to think about advocacy at the local level for the school board. And we are there in many of our communities, we are there about another important matter that doesn't have to do with liturgy per se, which is advocating for trans and non-binary kids and families. And so some of us are already connected in our local school boards because of that. And it seems to me a great thing for you to help us think, well, there are other things related to education
Yeah.
at the local level, including
Mhm.
music. I want to shift gears a little bit and get to two kind of things. One is so-called open communion, and just say a word to Maine about that. I think most of our congregations in Maine do not say that baptized Christians only are welcome to receive. We know that that's not the official stance of our church. I I've adopted a language, a particular phraseology. When I was at Epiphany Winchester early on there, I would always say something like, "Here at Parish of the Epiphany, we welcome all who desire to receive communion." And a dear friend and a theologian challenged me about that and said, you are not making the invitation, and neither is your parish. It is Jesus Christ who welcomes everybody who desires to receive him in the sacrament of his body and blood. And so I've adopted that phraseology, and it may fall on many lay people's ears as nothing, but to me it really is an important theological point that it's not the local clergy person who is making it open communion, and it's not the local parish, but theologically those of us who do believe in this, to reframe it to say this is really Jesus Christ. But aside from that personal testimony, what are some of the things that you, in your role as chair and the work on the commission, would say to us in Maine, either as encouragement or potentially as caution for those of us who care about this?
I think for many of us, especially clergy, this is deeply personal
Mm,
at some level for any number of reasons. I know it is for me, and so it's hard for me to separate it. It was hard for me to separate it as a parish priest, and it's hard for me to separate it as the chair of the SCLM. And God, I feel like I've gotten old enough to just keep telling stories. But um, when I was in seminary, I would have weekly phone calls with my parents, and one of those Saturday mornings, my father very excitedly told me about how his parish priest had asked him to be a lay reader. And this was the early 80s, so that helps give a context for folks. And my dad was a every 8 o'clock, every Sunday 8 o'clock kind of guy. And even when they traveled, he went to church. They would find some place to worship. And my mother's a travel agent, so there was a lot of traveling going on. But every Sunday he was in church. So when the priest asked him to be lay reader, he was very excited about this and wanted to know from his kid, who was in seminary, what was involved. So we talked a little bit about it and moved on. The next week when we talked, he was very disappointed. He'd gone back the next day to tell the priest that yes, he would be willing to be a lay reader. And the priest handed him a form. And in those days, in order to be a lay reader, you had to be baptized.
mm,
And my dad was raised Unitarian
mm,
and was never baptized. And so when he traveled and he went to a church where it said all baptized Christians are welcome to receive communion, or any of the number of things that we thought we were saying to welcome people to God's table, he would not take communion. Whereas if a congregation didn't put anything in their bulletin about who was
yeah.
welcome to receive, he would take communion. Um, but when I was telling my classmates that story, almost to a person, their first question was, "Well, did you offer to baptize your father?"
Mm,
And I thought, that kind of misses the point for
yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And I think it misses the point for it missed the point for me, as a parish priest. Um, Obviously, I had responsibilities um, to educate and all of that about the opportunities through baptism. But I think you've hit the nail on the head with it being God's table, it being Jesus who offers the invitation, and that's why I say it's really it's a personal thing for me, and I it's hard for me to forget that story, and I imagine a lot of your clergy have had similar kinds of experiences somewhere along the line. So when it
One of the
comes to
things,
the, go ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that for me, I know that it's the House of Bishops who continues to be the conserving voice and continues, at least in my memory of the last several general conventions when this question has come and potential authorization has been debated. uh, it's the one place where I know I don't know that I'm in a minority in the House of Bishops, but I know that if there are bishops who watch this, and there are at least two on the distribution, um, that there are many of my colleagues who feel absolutely differently from me about this, which
Mhm.
is to say that
Yep.
they are um, fervently opposed to this so-called open communion. I wonder, just